Welcome back to GMBN, everybody. It's episode 2 time of the Bikes of Enduros, and I am excited. I've got 3 more absolute belters for you. I've got a little French fancy, some American muscle, and something rather exotic from the Canadian Rockies. What are they? First up, we've got your second place overall finisher from last year's EWS series, Florian Nicolai. Now, he went down to the battle to the absolute wire with Sam Hill. It came down to the last race and the last stage. So you can bet that absolutely no corners were cut when it came to getting that bike prepped and ready. Florian stands at a proud 183 centimeters tall. He rides a size large Canyon Strive CFR. Now, this bike has 170mm travel up front and 155 out back. It also has Canyon's shapeshifter on it, which adjusts the head angle, so it goes from 66 to 67.5. The reach is also 464mm. When it comes to suspension, that's taken care of courtesy of RockShox. Running a RockShox Lyric Ultimate up front and a Super Deluxe out back, these are both meticulously tuned to just how Flo likes them. He's pretty specific with his setup and has exactly 155 PSI in the rear shock and 90 PSI in the forks. Running approximately 3 tokens, but this does change. Should the trails decide to get really rough and wild like they did in Zermatt at the last round last year, he did actually bump up fork travel to 180mm. That's mental. The 29-inch wheels that this bike is shod with are DT Swiss's 1501 wheel set, front and rear. Also front and rear, tyre inserts. Most of the people are running them, as is Flo. The internal rim width is 30mm, and he likes this because it gives a great profile to the tyre. Talking of tyres, what's he got? Well, there's some interesting tech going on here. First up, we have a Maxxis Minion DHR 2.5 downhill casing out the back. Nothing too out of the ordinary there, a great tyre and very grippy. The front tyre is where things get a little bit more interesting. Now, again, it's a 2.5-inch width tyre, it's a Maxxis and it's an Assegai, a great tyre which works really well. But this one is one of the test pilot tyres, so that's a prototype. I don't know what compound it is, but it is a slightly softer, different compound. More than likely just trying it out on the rough trails of Zermatt. Pressures wise in those tyres, it's 25 PSI up front and 27 PSI out the back. Now couple that obviously with the downhill casing, the inserts, and he's probably going to avoid, fingers crossed, most punctures. Up the front of the bike then, it's cockpit time, and Flo's running Canyon's in-house components. He's using a 40mm G5 stem and 780mm G5 carbon bars. He likes the feel of the carbon bars, so that's what he runs with. Attached to those bars then, well, there's a few interesting bits and pieces. SRAM's Axis wireless group set's used, which we'll get onto shortly, but he's also using the Axis wireless dropper. Interestingly, Larry, his mechanic, puts grip tape on that to aid Flo without slipping a cheeky thumb anywhere. Grips wise, it's Ergon's GE1 super tacky grips. He finds that these are a lovely compound and nice and comfortable for the entirety of the race. Another neat little trick that his mechanic Larry does is attaches the number board on using some special mounts, not just your standard zip ties. He has these great little mounts that sort of clamp around the bars and through the zip tie, holding it much firmer in place. His reasoning, well, a quiet bike is a fast bike, and I couldn't agree more. 170mm Axis dropper sits inside the frame, and on top of that is Ergon's SM Pro men's saddle as well, keeping his butt comfy for the whole weekend. Out back then is SRAM's Axis group set, the 1050 cassette being able to get him up anything. And interestingly, another one to add a bit of security on the mech and just have a bit of electrical tape helping to hold that battery on. It's not generally going to go anywhere, but these are the roughest, toughest conditions. Interestingly, there's also a spare battery attached to the frame just behind the bottle cage. Talking about the bottle cage, well, his mechanic must be fond of the grip tape because it's on the inside of that as well. And that's just to help hold the bottle in place. I mean, it's not going to do your bottle any favors, but it's going to stop you losing a bottle mid-race, and nobody wants to get dehydrated. This bike here that you're seeing, it was a custom painted one for Flo for the last few races of the season. And now that the season's over and we're 2020, Flo's actually moved on to Trek Factory Enduro racing. So all the best on that, and we look forward to seeing how you're going to do when the race season kicks off again. Richie Rude, the 25-year-old American muscle, had a pretty bloomin' successful season last year. He won 3 rounds and podiumed every single round he was in. Known for not being the lightest on bikes and components perhaps, this is going to be an interesting bike check, so let's dive in and have a look at his Yeti factory bike. Interestingly, Richie is 182 centimeters tall, so only just shorter than myself at 6 foot. But he rides a size medium Yeti SB150. It's a 29er front and rear with a 64.5-degree head angle. The reach on it is 460mm, but you would have thought being that tall he would actually ride a large, so interesting to see why he's opted for a medium. Also at 93 kilos he's a bit of a bruiser, so there's bound to be some great suspension setup tips. As the name suggests, there's 150mm travel out the back, and this is paired to 170mm travel fork up the front. This Yeti frame uses what a lot of the frames do and has their Switch Infinity link. It's something that allows the bike to have great pedaling platform, but yet still amazing small bump efficiency. Damping duties are taken care of by Fox. There's a Float X2 air shock out the back with approximately 210 PSI in it. This changes ever so slightly race to race perhaps. Up front is a Fox 36 with 93 or so PSI in, and that is stacked full of tokens. Like I said, at 93 kilos he's a fair old rider, so it sits nicely high in the travel. Being one of the fastest guys in the world has its perks, and being a Fox factory athlete also has its perks, as at the end of the last season Richie was seen running the new 38 fork. Now bigger stanchions and stiffer crown mean that this is absolutely suited to his riding style, and it showed with his results. The wheels on the Yeti go round and round then, and that is because they're DT Swiss's 511 wheel set front and rear. Again, with a 30mm internal rim width, this really seems to be the magic number amongst racers, giving a good tyre profile, but also compromising between strength and weight. Interestingly, and I guess not particularly out of the blue, is that he's gone for the 32 spoke wheels over the 28 for strength. Another rider on Maxxis tyres then, but this time he's opted for Assagai's front and rear. They're both 2.5 and they're both in the downhill casing with the 3C compound. There's no test pilots on this one, but I don't think that really matters for Richie. He's also using Cushcore front and rear as well. With 27 PSI at the front and 29 PSI out back, he really is running some pretty firm tyres compared to a lot of people out there, and doing everything he can to avoid wheel damage or getting punctures. Braking and group set are a full Shimano affair, but let's take a look at the brakes and his setup there first. The brakes themselves, well, they're Shimano's 4-pot XTRs. Tons of braking power, and coupled up with those Ice-Tech rotors, should be more than enough to try and slow down the American muscle. Setup preference on the brakes, well, he does have his particular ways. He doesn't like much free play in the brakes. What I mean by that is not much modulation or movement before they engage. When they pull, they work. Simples. And let's face it, when you're going at Mach 10, you want your brakes to work. Cranks are 170mm XTR paired with a 32 tooth chainring. The chain is kept in place by a 1-up chain guide just to stop any mishaps and for that extra security. And out the back is a 1051 XTR cassette and mech on shifting duties. Now that is a huge range and should winch him up the steepest of EWS and race hills. The seat post, well, that's courtesy of Fox and a Kashima coated transfer at 175mm. I guess the long drop because he's on a medium frame. It also keeps the saddle nice and low out the way. Speaking of which, that's again an Ergon SM Pro. Other contact points, well, there's Ergon's GE1 super tacky grips up front as well. He likes these, very similar to Flow. They are nice and comfortable and very grippy. Pedals are Shimano's downhill Saint pedal. Solid and reliable, you can't go wrong with those things. Steering duties, well, they're taken care of via rental. There's a 40mm Apex stem clamping a 750mm wide rental aluminium fat bar. Why aluminium? Well, much like Isabeau Cordurio's bike, he's opted for strength over sort of weight. If he crashes, an aluminium bar may bend or give slightly, whereas a carbon bar is just gonna crack. A couple of cool little features are neatly tucked inside that stem is the 1-Up Components EDC tool, a little multi-tool that's stashed neatly away. He's also got a nice factory looking color coded strap just holding all his gear, his tube, multi-tool, tyre levers, etc. on the bike. 2019 was a hell of a year for Richie. It's going to be really interesting to see if he can battle for that top step in 2020, and I'm sure we'll have a bike check for you when he does. Lastly, but not leastly then, we have Andreane Lanthier Nadeau. Commonly known as ALN on the race circuit, last year she had her most successful season to date, finishing the EWS Series 3rd overall. Taking multiple stage wins and multiple podiums, ALN made the switch in 2015 from racing cross country and now races for the Rocky Mountain Raceface Enduro team at the world's highest level. ALN rides a Rocky Mountain Instinct BC edition, a size medium with a 65-degree head angle. There's 155mm travel out back and 160mm up front. The reach, well, that's 454mm. On the suspension front, it's an all Fox affair. The rear suspension is a Fox X2 Air rear shock with a lockout lever, making those long liaisons far more bearable. Up front, a Fox 36 is on damping duty with the Grip 2 damper. Now, she runs a 160mm travel fork, like I said, whilst the rest of her teammates actually run a 170mm fork, purely for the way it makes the bike feel, and that's just how she likes it. Wheel setup of ALN, well, this is a really interesting one, and one that we've not seen on a bike yet. Up the front is an aluminium Raceface wheel. She likes this because it's slightly more forgiving and more compliant. Whilst out the back is a Raceface Next R carbon wheel. Bucking the trend here, there is not a 30mm internal width, rather than a 31mm. Crazy, I know, but ever so slightly different and nothing that's going to make a huge amount of difference on the trail. Cush core inserts are used front and rear, and it's an XC style cush core on the front and the full Enduro one on the back. That mix and match wheel set is rolling on Maxxis tyres, as is the rest of the team. On the rear is a Minion DHR2, whilst up front is an Assegai, both with double down casing and at 2.5 width. 2.5 seeming to be the optimum width that most racers are choosing to go for. Onto the cockpit then, and a 40mm Raceface stem with a 35mm diameter Raceface Next R carbon bar are the order of the day, cut down to about 760mm. Also a 35mm rise, which is actually a fairly high rise nowadays. Brakes, they're Shimano's XTR 4 pots with 203 rotors front and rear, and it's those Ice Tech rotors, trying to eke out as much of that braking power as possible. As for lever position, nothing too crazy here. There's nothing too steep or like any of the really flat levers that we get to see sometimes, a fairly neutral lever position. Gearing, that's also XTR. 170mm length crank is paired up to a 32-tooth chainring. On the left-hand crank arm actually though, interestingly is a Stages power meter. Now this will help ALN keep an eye on her effort both during the race, but also analyse the data and see what she could possibly improve on afterwards when it comes to adapting and changing her training. The back is an XTR cassette 1051 with an XTR mech of course. That's enough again to winch anyone up the steepest of hills. And trying to keep things as quiet as possible, there's again a custom chainstay protector to stop any chain slap and banging around. There's a really cool custom WTB saddle on top of a Fox 150mm drop transfer dropper post. Interestingly, this also does have the Raceface lever for it, not the Fox one. Other really cool little bits are that she uses the 1-up EDC both in the steerer tubes and the pump. So she's got the pump and then she can stash in the top things like a chain link, zip ties, multi-tool obviously, and then the pump can have the CO2 cartridges and be used as a standard pump. Down near the linkage, there's a custom little mudguard to stop any crud building up in the bearings and in the linkage and doing any damage there. And just behind that little bottle cage of hers, there's also the tube tyre levers just neatly strapped with a rubber strap. That's a wrap then on 3 more of the fastest bikes going around the EWS race circuit at the moment. Now, if you want to check out more GMBN, obviously hit that subscribe button. Go on, it doesn't hurt, I promise. Give us a thumbs up and head over to the shop if you want to, match your t-shirt with your table and get one of these GMBN core t-shirts. Thanks for watching everyone and catch you next time. Cheers.